When I left government in 2003, Colin Powell gave me two pieces of advice. The first piece of advice was don't ever try to come back. That one I took with great enthusiasm. I had my 25 years. We did some good things. We did a lot of damage. And I decided that it was time to leave and to become part of the public conversation to the degree that that's important and that matters. The second piece of advice Powell gave me, though, I ignored, which was not to look back. And I felt a sort of ethical and moral responsibility to try to learn and at least analyze what it is we, the United States, and the Republican and Democratic secretaries of state, presidents for whom I worked and whose administrations I worked, what we had done wrong, and could we amend, recalibrate, redesign a policy for the United States that might, in fact, be effective. My point of departure was very simple, that the dividing line, having worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republicans and Democrats, the dividing line for domestic as well as foreign policy to me was very simple. It's not between left and right, liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. It should be between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that should matter, in my view, was which side of the line do you want America to be on? The smart side or the dumb side? Now, there are certain things each of us, in my judgment, could do to ensure that America tried to remain on the smart side. So I didn't come today to, borrowing a line from the Bard, to bury Trump's foreign policy or to praise it, but frankly to try to understand it. So I'm going to offer a number of observations as quickly as I possibly can. I have a tendency to drone on, so Patrick, if you could keep me honest. First, the Trump administration seems to me inherited from its predecessors, plural, what I would describe to you as a broken, angry, dysfunctional Middle East. And the United States, while playing its part in this brokenness, dysfunction, and anger, was not the main driving force or mainly responsible for why the Middle East was the way it was. But U.S. administrations, particularly Bush 43 and Barack Obama, played their respective roles. They got some things right. I would argue some things very right, but they also got some things very wrong. The key dynamic during this period, it seems to me, was to try to find the elusive balance between George W. Bush's risk aversion on one hand, and the case has been made, maybe historical perspective will vindicate it, maybe not, Barack Obama's the balance between George W. Bush's risk readiness and Barack Obama's risk aversion. Therein lies the dilemma, the conundrum, and the real challenge for American foreign policy in this region, toward the world generally. Trying to find the balance between doing too much on one hand and not enough on the other. That is a very elusive balance for the great power, particularly for the United States, I think, for many different reasons. But that was the goal. Second, the key dynamic, in my judgment, that has dominated that challenge for the United States is the absence of what I call comprehensive end states for any, and I would challenge anybody in this room to prove me wrong, any of the core issues and concerns for the United States. There are no comprehensive end states or solutions right now, as I see it, toward any of the major challenges we face. The future of Syria, what to do about Iran, how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the future of the region as generally, to try to convert dysfunction into functional, let alone good governance, functional governance, the capacity of any nation state to provide for the basic security and prosperity of its citizens. Those are huge challenges, and I would argue to you they do not have solutions. They have outcomes. And the challenge for the United States is to decide whether or not we can shape those outcomes in a way that benefits American interests as well as the interests of those who live in the region. My own notion of the United States is as a modern-day Gulliver, wandering around in the part of the world that we do not understand, tied up by our own illusions and by tiny powers whose interests episodically may be ours, but not across the board. 3, the Trump administration, in my view, instead of trying to find a better balance and confronting the conundrum that we face, we cannot transform the region and we cannot extricate ourselves from it. That is the conundrum, because I don't think there is an easy way out. It's a problem without a solution. If we can't transform and we can't leave because we have allies, interests, and adversaries, what in fact do we do? I'll save that for later. But the Trump administration, in my view, avoided that central question of looking at the region as a whole with any sort of strategic visions. And by the way, strategy gets a bad name, I think. I mean, it usually results in comprehensive, global, sort of galactic concepts on the part of the United States that don't usually apply to the region as a whole, and we usually fail at them. But you need to at least analyze strategically, even if you don't operate operationally strategically. I would argue to you the Trump administration avoided that central challenge and went about creating a policy that moved in very different directions. And it's hard, really, to characterize. There was some continuity with his predecessor, but there was more, I think you would agree, a sharp break with not only with Mr. Trump's predecessor, but with previous Democratic and certainly Republican administration. Now, I would argue that the directions that the policy took were characterized by 3 or 4 major themes. And these themes, not coincidentally, applied not just to Middle East policy, but to the Trump foreign policy generally. And the first is the issue of domestic politics. All administrations, everyone that I worked for, from Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush, all took into account domestic political concerns as they made their policies, but there was a preternatural, almost obsession on the part of the Trump administration to root and anchor its foreign policy in domestic political concerns. Whether that was delivering on campaign commitments or alternatively, and there was some coincidence between that and becoming the anti-Obama, which became a motivating force for the administration. And you saw that in withdrawal from Trans-Pacific Partnership, you saw that withdrawal from Paris Climate, you saw that with respect to the administration's immigration policies, and as it pertained to the Middle East, in at least 2 cases specifically, you saw the ascent, triumph of domestic politics over sound foreign policy, national security interests. One is the decision to open, not move, and that's what the 1995 Jerusalem Act legislation calls for. It doesn't call for moving the embassy to Jerusalem, it calls for opening an embassy in Jerusalem. That was the triumph, in my judgment, of domestic political concerns over sound foreign policy considerations. And the other was the obvious one, which was the withdrawal from a highly flawed, but in my judgment, functional JCPOA, Iran nuclear agreement. Flawed because it was a transactional arrangement, an arms control agreement in essence, to provide a restraint and constraint for a specific period of time to manage a problem that the Obama administration simply could not resolve. And Barack Obama did not want to leave Washington, allowing the Iranians to cross a nuclear threshold or quote-unquote breakout, the amount of time that's required to produce enough fissile material to make one nuclear weapon, nor did it want to use military force to deal with that problem or to create a situation in which the Israelis somehow felt compelled to do so. So it was, I would argue, highly flawed, but still functional. And the withdrawal from that agreement had much to do, not only with the president's own sensibilities and proclivities, that he, in fact, could negotiate a better accord. By the way, tuck that away, because I think that still remains as elusive as it now appears to me, a consideration in the president's mind. So domestic politics became paramount. And it resulted in what I call coming up with solutions to problems that we didn't have. There was no need to withdraw from the JCPOA, and there was no need to open an embassy in Jerusalem. No foreign policy compelling need. So the administration came up with a solution to a problem it didn't have, and in my judgment, in doing that, it made the problem worse. That's the first unifying principle. Second is risk aversion. And there is continuity here between this administration and its predecessor. This administration, when it comes to the projection of military force, is highly risk averse. And you see that in a number of its initiatives and behaviors. The proportionate strikes now twice against Syrian chemical weapons facilities. Maybe a large part of that is a consequence of Jim Mattis. I suspect that's probably true. But it's also inherently, in my view, a consequence of the president's own natural inclination not to project American military power in ways that could create, well, how do I put this, more forever wars. You saw that in the moderate surge in Afghanistan. You see it even now, despite the tough rhetoric in places like Syria. I am stunned, or with Iran, I am stunned that there has been no kinetic activity, direct application of American military power against Syrian or Iranian assets, either in the Gulf or in Syria. Maybe one. Strikes against pro-Shia militias that were encroaching on an American military base, as to formal a word, near Tanaf. So I'm interested and intrigued by the gap between rhetoric on one hand and deeds on the other. Third, driven by the need to be the anti-Obama, there was a tendency, not just a tendency, a determination on the part of the administration to improve relations with three countries that the president and the administration believed its predecessor had undermined. And those are the three traditional relationships, not counting Jordan and Morocco, that we had maintained ties with. The Israelis, the Saudis, and the Egyptians. This to me is unmistakably clear. The amount of latitude and freedom of action that this president has accorded to these three powers, Israel and Saudi Arabia in particular, is extraordinary. Watching this studying this for nearly 50 years and participating in shaping in various roles U.S. policy toward this region, I've never encountered an administration like this, who's willing literally to give carte blanche without imposing any consequences or costs on the behaviors, clearly, of the Israelis and the Saudis. And we see this most alarmingly, as I've spent time over the last 48 hours in every way I could, trying to drive home this fundamental point of the absence of reciprocity. Certainly in the relationship with Saudi Arabia, we cannot abandon that, but we need to seriously recalibrate this relationship. But that notion that we would build our policy, forget the Israelis for a moment, on Riyadh was magical thinking as far as I'm concerned. That the Saudis would be the central driving force in our containment policy toward Iran. They would help us moderate oil prices. And of course, they would play a central role in the fashioning of the yet-to-be-announced 40-page ultimate deal proposal, which is coming. The question is, of course, when. And finally, the fourth characteristics is the issue of values and interests. I would argue with John McCain, a man whom I respected greatly, that this was a much more complicated relationship than he would point out, but he believed deeply that our values are our interests and our interests are our values. I see that. We cannot abandon the moral and ethical principles that we stand for, but at the same time I watch our behavior and I realize the gap between what we claim to do with respect to human rights and the reality of our actions is Grand Canyon-like. And I do not believe it is wise to say something repeatedly if you're not prepared to do something about it. I'd only point out that over the last 70 years, with the exception of Bosnia and maybe Kosovo, the United States and the international community has failed to intercede in any mass killing or genocide. From the Nazi Holocaust to Cambodia to Rwanda to Darfur to South Sudan to the Rohingya to Syria. This is the track record. And this has to be faced up to honestly by Americans. But Mr. Trump emptied any meaningful resonance of values from our foreign policy lexicon or behavior, even while he interceded selectively in Egypt twice and in Turkey with Pastor Brunson to secure their release. This is a highly personalized form of the protection of human rights, which I would argue doesn't assume universal proportion. Just a couple more points. I think that we face, and I've laid it out for you as clearly as I could, a real challenge. And that is, if you can't transform the region, and Iraq and Afghanistan, trillion-dollar social science projects suggest to me that we cannot, and you cannot extricate yourselves from the region, then you're really only left with one choice. And that is a word the president favors and that would seem to characterize his policy, but I'm not entirely sure it's the way I would intend it, and that is transaction. Transaction doesn't mean everything is about a bottom line or a real estate deal in Brooklyn or Manhattan. What it means is that the United States has core interests that it needs to protect. It needs to identify what those core interests are and then drill down on them and do it in a way that is serious with some sense of strategy. Now, I would identify those core interests very conservatively. They relate to security and the prosperity of the United States, and it's not an America First strategy. We have a leadership role to play, and we can play it. But I think we need to adopt, finally, a much different view of what's happening in this region. And I don't think we're there yet. I think this administration is there, perhaps for all the wrong reasons. But it's going to be extremely difficult to find these end states and comprehensive solutions. And as I mentioned earlier, I think shaping outcomes on the way to resolving these problems may be the best we can do. I'll close with a line from JFK, the first president who had an emotional impact on me. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. So I'm looking at the last 40 years of my professional career, and I basically borrow that. I like that phrase. Idealism without illusion. I think that's where America needs to be. Never giving up on the fact that it can play a role, a meaningful and significant role. But as we go through the process of trying to do it, we have no choice but to go through it with our eyes wide open. Patrick would be more than happy to take some questions. Yep.
Cheat and ask the first question. There seems to be in this administration a desire to push Saudi Arabia to do things, to finance the rebuilding of Iraq, to finish, to provide the cover to stop the to finish the Palestinian issue, to create an alliance between Israel and other Arab states against Iran. Leaving aside the likelihood of these things happening, are we running into the risk of damaging the, other relationships or even damaging the country that we've set about making our champion?
Yeah, I mean, is our relationship with the Saudis, well, we have a special relationship with the Saudis. It's now become, in my judgment, exclusive. And I might add, even though they're very different situations, we have a special relationship with the Israelis, which in my view has become far too exclusive. And these are the two relationships that developed the early, well, other than Morocco, developed in the late 40s. And we'd managed to compartmentalize our policy and maintain ties with both. I mean, I think the the argument, Patrick, is clear. I think we have chosen sides. Some would argue that's exactly what we need to do for the purposes of moral clarity, that Iran is now the greatest threat to the fulcrum of Western civilization. Don't we understand that? And we need to adjust our policies accordingly. I don't buy that. I mean, we need to cooperate with the Iranians when we can and when it is in our interest to do so, and we need to confront them if cooperation is not a possibility and if they threaten our interests. That's the way we should essentially conduct ourselves with all of these countries. But we don't do that. We've moralized it. We've turned this into a morality play. I don't know and cannot comment on the degree to which business investments, past, present, and future, play a role in motivating the Trump administration. I mean, clearly, $110 billion in arms sales is more a thought experiment than it is a reality. I think that the U.S.-Saudi relationship has fundamentally been altered. The oil for security trade-off that has powered this relationship for decades is breaking down. They do not trust us with respect to protecting their security. We are becoming much less dependent on Arab hydrocarbons, particularly theirs, even though energy security is still very important. So is there a risk? Well, yeah, but you're also dealing with a number of other dysfunctional actors in the Gulf that have their own agendas. And I think we just need to separate ourselves with a degree of detachment that seems very difficult for Americans. And I think my broader concern is that we really don't, and I would put myself at the top of the list. I mean, we made a lot of mistakes over the course of 25 years. But a lot of them flow from one basic fact, and that is what I call geographic determinism, where we are. We are the only great power in the history of the world that is sandwiched between two non-predatory powers to our north and south, and literally fish to our east and west, what one historian, wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets, all right? No other nation on earth has these advantages. That affords us a margin of error which no other power in the world has. It affords us this notion that all problems can be fixed and we can fix them, and it makes us, I think, very naive when it comes to understanding why small powers who have not freed themselves from the forces of history and geography, as we have, and small powers, including the Russians and the Chinese, by the way, will never free themselves from the forces of history. We have, to a large extent. And it makes us do things that don't make any sense. So I would not trade this privileged position for anything. It makes us who we are in terms of what is so wonderful about the opportunities, and even the nature of our political system, as dysfunctional as it now is. It's not for export. But we have to realize what the implications are of not seeing the world, or seeing the world only in terms of what we think we can create based on our experience.
Fabulous. There are far too many questions, and I'll try and group the thought. But there, from Lami Alfar, to what do you attribute Trump's determination to pivot the relationships with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel? Domestic politics to some extent with Israel, but certainly not Egypt or Saudi Arabia. This is a question I suspect that might lead to what do you believe was the impetus in terms of the domestic policies of the United States?
I mean, I think there are three core communities that are critically important to the Trump administration. And I said to you, all administrations deal in domestic politics, but this one has gone far and above, in my judgment, its concern with them. There clearly is the pro-Israeli community. There are the evangelical community. Let's be clear. I interviewed Mike Pence in '06 for one of my books, and he just didn't decide today for reasons of eschatology, end of times, end of days, and values to become a supporter of Israel. This is faith. This is something that is believed. And right now, the evangelical community in the United States, at least the older evangelicals, the dispensationalists, are much more unified, frankly, in their support of Israel than the Jewish community, and conservative Republicans. And I think that's very dangerous and damaging. There's now a Democratic view of Israel and a Republican view of Israel. And that, if you believe in the importance of a special but not exclusive relationship with the Israelis, is highly damaging and creates a very fraught future. Saudis don't have domestic constituencies here. The Israelis do, neither do the Egyptians. So that's separated out. So the rest of it, I think, is, look, this president went, unlike his four predecessors, who I believe either went to Mexico or Canada for their first foreign foray. This president went to Saudi Arabia and Israel. That's just not normal. I mean, people don't go to Saudi Arabia and Israel on their first foreign trips. And then the trip is divided literally into two halves. The happy part, which is where he was feted, flattered, and had a wonderful time. And then there was the next part, where he dealt with our European allies and our democratic polities. So you explain it. It's hard for me to explain it.
One last question. We've already run out of time, but so sort of an amalgam of questions. The big news of this last 2 weeks have been the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Where do you think this is leading?
I would like to think that, well, let me begin this way. How we respond to this will depend on what it is we want to achieve. Do we want to achieve a politically expedient exit, where in fact we can return with some broken crockery to business as usual with the Saudis relatively quickly? Or are we interested in punishing, because you can't bring Jamal back, but to punish for what the Saudis have done and or to deter future actions? And finally, or are we determined to send an unmistakable signal that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is, I wrote recently in the Atlantic, out of control, and that it needs to be recalibrated and reset? If the Saudis want to go ahead and pursue policies, that's, as the president has said, what you do internally, we're not here to preach to you, but not with our support. That's the fundamental question that nobody asks. I mean, I can think of 13 things that we could do. The question is, what is it that we want to achieve? And I suspect in the next 48 hours or so, and if I were Mike Pompeo, I would want to be as far away from Saudi Arabia as possible. If in fact there is going to be a statement, and that statement is going to be issued, because we cannot afford to have our fingerprints on this statement. Because a rendition that went bad, is that any better than a premeditated murder? And I think I know the answer to that. And we need to make it unmistakably clear. In my view, there has to be some accountability for so many reasons. Will there be? I can't say.
Aaron, thank you so much. I'm really happy you came today.